In the spring of 2025, an already tense trade relationship between the United States and Canada took a dramatic turn. Alberta, the heart of Canada's oil industry, cut crude oil and refined fuel exports to the United States in half, a move that rattled energy markets and set off a ripple effect across several northern states. What began as a tariff dispute quickly escalated into something far more serious, an energy shock that left gas stations shuttered, trucking companies idling their fleets, and households facing record-breaking fuel costs. The crisis exposed the deep interdependence of the two countries and underscored just how vulnerable regional economies remain to cross-border supply disruptions. Alberta produces the bulk of Canada's crude oil and refined fuels, much of which has historically flowed south to United States refineries and gas stations. When Washington imposed fresh tariffs on Canadian goods, Ottawa authorized Alberta to reduce energy shipments in response. Pipelines throttled, major systems like the Enbridge Mainline and Trans Mountain were suddenly operating below capacity, exports halved. United States supply from Alberta fell by nearly 50%. Immediate fallout. Midwest and Great Lakes states dependent on Canadian crude began running short within days. Alberta framed its move as a protective measure to stabilize domestic supplies and prices, but in United States states along the northern border, the effect was immediate and painful. Few states felt the crunch as quickly as Michigan, which relies heavily on Alberta crude shipped via the Enbridge pipeline network. Within 72 hours of the export-cut gas stations in Detroit, Flint, and Grand Rapids began posting out of fuel signs. Prices surged from $3.95 to $4.65 per gallon in just 4 days. Rationing rules limited drivers to 10 gallons per vehicle. The state's economy, already sensitive due to its role as a logistics hub for the Midwest, began showing strain. Freight carriers cut long-haul runs to Illinois and Ohio. Frozen food distributors warned of potential shortages. Auto plants in Detroit and Lansing reduced shifts, as finished cars couldn't be transported. Governor Gretchen Whitmer declared an energy emergency, ordering the release of state fuel reserves and relaxing regulations for tanker drivers. Still, officials warned that if supply wasn't restored within 2 weeks, gasoline could top $5 per gallon and trucking companies could collapse. Ironically, North Dakota, one of America's top oil producers, was hit hard. The state refines relatively little of its own crude, depending instead on imports from Alberta and Great Lakes refineries. Within 48 hours, gas stations in Minot and Williston limited sales to 10 gallons. Prices rose from $3.85 to $4.45 per gallon in 3 days. Farmers preparing for the wheat, soybean, and canola harvest cut back on machinery use. Freight companies reported fuel costs climbing over 25%. In border towns, drivers waited in line for hours. In some rural areas, informal black markets emerged, with gasoline priced 30% higher than at official stations. Governor Doug Burgum urged Washington to release federal fuel reserves and temporarily loosen regulations on fuel transport. With vast distances between towns, Montana is uniquely vulnerable to fuel shortages. When Alberta restricted exports, the state's fragile supply system broke down quickly. In Billings and Great Falls, drivers queued for hours and were limited to just 8 to 10 gallons. Stations in mountain towns like Kalispell, well, they ran dry. Long-haul routes connecting Montana to Idaho and Washington basically stalled. The consequences spread fast. Cold chain deliveries of perishable goods were disrupted. Farmers and ranchers had to delay operations during peak season, and transport costs spiked, driving up food prices within days. The state ordered fuel prioritization for essential services like healthcare, firefighting, and urgent freight. Still, without Canadian supply, Montana risked widespread transport paralysis. Northern New York, especially the counties bordering Quebec and Ontario, faced some of the most acute shortages. Stations in Watertown and Plattsburgh closed or rationed sales. Residents often drove 50 to 60 kilometers just to refuel. Prices north of $5.30 per gallon became pretty common. Farmers, fishermen, and truckers were squeezed hardest. Bus services cut routes and freight slowed down. Governor Kathy Hochul declared a state of emergency in border counties, releasing reserves and seeking supplemental imports. As the Pacific Northwest's energy hub, Washington state really depends on fuel from Alberta routed through British Columbia. Imports plunged by 60%. Storage tanks at Cherry Point hit record lows. Gasoline in Seattle spiked above $6 per gallon, the highest in 20 years. Effects rippled across industries. Fishermen docked boats for lack of diesel, truckers cut a third of their trips, and fruit growers faced missing critical market windows. Ports in Seattle and Tacoma saw declining activity, threatening supply chains for the entire West Coast. So, Maine, which is, really dependent on fuel imports from New Brunswick, faced some pretty steep disruptions. Imports dropped by more than half. Reserves in Portland and Bangor sank to 10-year lows. Gasoline shot up past $6 per gallon, and heating oil prices also surged, raising a lot of fears for the coming winter. Fishermen ended up canceling trips since diesel costs outpaced their profits. Farms in Aroostook County struggled just to run their machinery. Seafood processors faced losing millions if their freezing equipment shut down. And tourism, which is already pretty sensitive to rising costs, also began to decline. Even though Vermont is small, it relies heavily on trade with Canada. Fuel imports fell by 40% within just 1 week. Burlington stations had to cap sales at 10 gallons per customer. Prices got really close to $6 per gallon, which was the highest in state history. Dairy farms just didn't have enough fuel for their tractors or milk trucks. Maple syrup producers had to suspend operations. Tourism dipped as visitors started avoiding those higher travel costs. With reserves lasting barely 10 days, Vermont was facing some pretty severe risks if the crisis kept going. As a key industrial and transport corridor, Pennsylvania faced a double blow: direct shortages and pressure to share with neighboring states. Storage in Philadelphia and Harrisburg dropped to just 10 to 12 days. Interstate gas stations along I-80 ran dry. Prices, rose over 25% in a week. Freight slowed, raising costs for steel, cement, and food processing plants. Small trucking firms risked collapse as expenses outpaced revenue. Urban retailers in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh reported sharp declines in foot traffic. What began as a tariff dispute has morphed into a multi-state energy emergency. Michigan, North Dakota, Montana, Minnesota, New York, Washington, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania are now at the center of an unfolding crisis. The consequences stretch beyond long lines at gas stations. Supply chains for food, autos, and manufactured goods are disrupted. Farmers risk losing harvests. Fishing fleets remain docked. Households face record-high travel and heating costs. Governors are urging federal action release of emergency reserves to stabilize supply, negotiations with Ottawa to restore pipeline flows, and temporary tax relief to cushion consumers. Experts caution that without a breakthrough, gas prices could exceed $6 to $7 per gallon in some states by summer, threatening not only local economies but also, honestly, consumer confidence nationwide. This crisis is a stark reminder of how tightly the United States and Canada are linked. For decades, Alberta's oil fields have fueled American cars, trucks, and industries. But in 2025, trade tensions revealed the fragility of that bond. If solutions are not found, the United States risks a prolonged period of elevated prices, strained supply chains, and weakened economic stability. Beyond the immediate disruption, the lesson is clear. Energy security in North America cannot be taken for granted.